Hi guys, it's Dr. Brandi Moore, and today we're going to be discussing what's a normal cycle. So in order to know if you have a normal cycle, you have to have an understanding of what a normal cycle is. So cycle is defined as day 1 of bleeding in 1 month to day 1 of bleeding in the next month. You count the number of days between day 1 and day 1, and that's how long your cycle is. That cycle length is typically between 26 to 36 days. Now, you might say, oh, but I went to my gynecologist and they said I had a 27-day cycle and that was really close together. Well, it could be, but you have to look at the totality of things, right? The whole picture here. If you've always had 27 days in between your cycle, then that's normal for you. Now, say you had a 36-day cycle and now all of a sudden you have a 27-day cycle, then we might need to do some further investigating as to if there's something deeper going on. On average, 28 days is the length, and typically when you speak with a provider or if you've ever seen a birth control pill pack, those are all based off of a 28-day cycle. You may fall outside of that, but kind of medically we funnel everyone in that 28-day cycle. So then we have the period, which I've heard the period confused with the cycle before. And society kind of use those interchangeably, meaning I've heard some people refer to the cycle as the time that they bleed, but technically the time that you bleed is your period and the full day 1 to day 1 is your cycle. So keep that in mind, because during this hormone series, we'll be referring to these different words, cycle and period, and they're not interchangeable. So your period is the time that you bleed, and that time can range from 3 days to 6 days. So anywhere in between there is normal. In the next upcoming weeks, we'll start talking about more abnormals, whether that be how much bleeding and things like that. So for right now, for the purposes of this day 1 video, 3 to 6 days is a normal time to bleed. So why do we have a cycle? Right? Why is it even there to begin with? A lot of women feel like it's unnecessary or it's annoying and they don't want it. But in reality, it's very useful. But the whole purpose of having a cycle is to have a baby. So your cycle's broken down, and this is the very basic of basic, but it's broken down into halves is what we'll call it. So the first half of the cycle, then you ovulate, then you have your second half of the cycle. The first half of the cycle is geared to making your body a great place for a baby to grow, right? So estrogen is the hormone that's highest in the first cycle, and we'll kind of dive deeper into what these individual hormones do, and then what happens when they're off in future videos. But for right now, estrogen is the dominant one in the first half of the cycle, and that makes your uterus lining grow, becoming very cushy. Think of it as you're creating a nest for your baby, right? And thicken the lining, make it really soft and awesome, and this egg wants to implant there, right? So the first half cycle is making the uterine lining bigger. Now the first half of the cycle, I should also say, includes the period, which is the bleeding, which I'll explain what that is at the end. But so we'll say you have your period, then you have your body trying to make your uterus an awesome place for an egg to live. Then hormone surge, and we'll get into kind of how that works in another video, but hormone surge, you release an egg. That egg then is waiting to be fertilized. And it's not waiting forever, it only is viable for 24 hours. But you have a surge that releases an egg from the ovary. And then after this egg is released, the second half of the cycle begins. And that is all about kind of preserving the uterine lining so that the baby can bury, I guess, so that the baby can implant into the uterine lining. If that implantation doesn't happen and you didn't create a baby that month, then what happens is we shed the lining. And when we start shedding the lining, that is what the period is. So that's why it's counted from day 1 to day 1. Because once we start bleeding, it's the brand new start of a cycle where we, shed the lining, build a new lining, ovulate, and then if we don't have a baby, the lining gets shed again. So that's kind of the basis of what our cycle is and why it's there. So now that we have an understanding of what the cycle is, in future videos, we're going to start tackling what happens when stuff goes wrong. What happens when that first phase is too short, or we're not ovulating, or what happens if our hormones, estrogen and progesterone, which I didn't mention, Progesterone manages the second half of that cycle. But what happens when estrogen and progesterone are imbalanced, right? What happens if our brain isn't giving the signals that it needs to our ovaries to release the hormones when they need to be releasing them? What happens then? So that's kind of why I wanted to create this hormone series, and that's some of the stuff that we'll tackle in the future. Please like the video if you liked it and share it with anyone that you think might benefit from it. This is Dr. Brandi Moore, and I want you to have a great day.